Do you have other stories maybe where there was like some different metrics that maybe people may not think of intuitively that helped you clarify those priorities and reshape how the leadership team made decisions?
Absolutely. So let me see. One of the examples that comes to mind is precisely, let's say, in terms of risk assessment, right? Particularly in the lending industry, you know that there is always a risk of getting sued, getting the missing one compliance piece. And what is the trade off between one or the other, right? I think there's two currents in terms of metrics. Let me take a step back. And I think that defining both of these is going to be super important. One current is you have to have metrics for everything. So now your team is focused on a lot of metrics instead of actually executing the drivers for those metrics. And usually what happens is if you define the wrong metrics, you're going to drive your business to the wrong side of the business, right? Because you're focusing too much into metrics that won't actually help your operation. And then there's the other side, which is no metrics at all. So no metrics, and everyone's just running like headless chickens, trying to figure out a way to execute. So I think balancing both of them, it's the trick here. And the trick will be you have to know what the trade-offs are for one or the other. So if we're thinking again on that risk assessment, right? Let's say, well, if I don't send my letter to the borrower right on time, right, that usually means that I'm not going to be able to collect default interest, right? So if I don't collect default interest, what does that matter? Well, I guess I'm being more lenient with the borrower, right? So it's going to cost me revenue, but on the other side, I'm gaining goodwill with the borrower, particularly if I upfront say, hey, you should be in default by now, but I'm trying to negotiate with you. So let's work together. So putting those two in the balance, and sometimes it's just a very simple Excel into like a scale potentially, or a matrix, like a 2x2 matrix where you put your cost of not doing it versus your cost of doing it. And then you can balance. I'm a very visual guy. So every time I put something on paper and I visualize one way or the other, it just helps me, define the pattern and define one of the metrics one way or the other.
Well, going back to like the human aspect and starting to hand off tasks, as leaders scale, protecting the focus becomes more critical. How have you seen like delegation from like executive and leadership teams work into workflows to help remove decision noise and strengthen follow through and creating space for better thinking?
I think we both have read Dan Martell book, Buy
Yeah.
Back Your Time. And I truly love that book because it provides a good framework for that. And in my experience, the way it works is if you don't have, a true passion for solving whatever it is that you're doing, like that's probably not the right thing you should be doing, right? Obviously, we know that businesses are made on the boring stuff, right? Being very consistent on the boring stuff. Let me talk about specifically when we're in the lending business before we're doing SaaS, right? So one of the most boring things we could do was reviewing the loans for closing, right? So, I know, Harley, you're probably a lender as well these days. And usually what that happens is there is a process where you collect all the documents, you read through the documents, you make any corrections or request any corrections, and then you move forward. The problem is that is a circular reference, right? So you go back, you do this over again, and then something changes, and you have to do it all over again, and then something else changes, and then you have to do it all over again. And at the same time, you're maintaining your information or your source of truth somewhere else, right? Either it's an Excel or you have a system, and you're trying to keep everything pieced together so it makes sense. First thing is that is a lot of cognitive load every single time, particularly if you have to think about those single steps every single time, right? So what we did, very pragmatic approach was, let's do a checklist, right? So this is the checklist for this document. This is for the checklist for this step, right? And then if you have to review one document again, you just have to review your checklist once again. And that usually provides some clarity into let's not think what we have to review every single time, but just execute the actions that we've thought in the past of what are the things that you have to review. So that's a good way of looking at the processes in terms of let's put what we do today so that we don't have to solve the same problem every single time or decide on every single time, because that just becomes very draining if you have to solve the same problem more than once. So once you've done that, then it's a matter of just execution of the same problems. Once you've done that at least once, you know whether that's something you love doing or it's something that you have to hire someone for. That's just my approach, and I've seen it work pretty well in the past.
It makes a ton of sense, and I can totally relate to like having the checklist. There's been many times in our businesses we have the staffing business, we also have our lending business, and procedure might be in place, but there's still some things getting missed periodically. We implement the checklist, and it's using technology is great because you can have that like visual kind of indicator of like how many of the checklist items are done, and it like changes color when you do that. And we found that just taking that checklist, kind of extrapolating from the SOP and putting it in like the task management portal really eliminates those issues. And it's amazing. So I'm glad you brought that checklist up.
Totally. I think just to add on top of that, Harley, one thing that I would like to add is you got to be consistent into adding the things into the checklist, but also removing things from the checklist.
Yeah, you got it.